know, competing against the U.S.-Germany game today, something we forgot to check our World Cup schedules when we programmed this.
Are these the only non-soccer fans in Washington?
Yes, anyone here, I mean, no one seems to have their, I was going to say, yeah, I don't see too many people with their iPads or their phones, so this is good. We're going to go ahead and get started in honor of those of you that are here on time. And an immense pleasure both to be presenting a book by George Kopitz, who's a distinguished colleague of ours here at the Wilson Center. He's a senior scholar and someone who I had a great pleasure to get to know in recent months. And Alice Rivlin, who needs no introduction, though I will introduce her in a second anyway, but is truly one of the outstanding public servants and thinkers in this country, and very honored to have her come over for the book launch, and she's also part of the book. We're talking about restoring public debt sustainability. This is like the announcement on the airlines when you get on and they say this flight is going to Phoenix, and you see people get up because they realize they're not supposed to. Okay, if that's not what you're here for, restoring public debt sustainability. This is an issue, as you will hear shortly, is of enormous how governments, and particularly how legislatures, but how governments in general track their budgets. This has been a trend around the world, but it's also a contentious trend, as you'll hear. It is an issue that has enormous impact both on democratic governance, which is something we care a great deal about at the Wilson Center, but also on fiscal sustainability of countries, right, on an economic path. George Kopitz is not only a senior scholar here at the Wilson Center, he spent much of his career at the IMF, including being assistant director. You have his bio here. He actually started the CBO equivalent in Hungary. He was born in Hungary, spent much of his life, if you don't mind me giving a bit of biography, in Argentina and then in the United States in high school and college, and most of his professional career. He had been in senior positions at the IMF. He served as a senior economist at the U.S. Treasury Department. He had consulted around the world, but he took the call and went back to his country of birth and really set up the CBO equivalent in Hungary, and has great experience with that, as well as serving on the Central Bank Committee for a number of years. Alice Rivlin set up what is our CBO, it's the Congressional Budget Office in the United States. It's one of the many things she's done in her illustrious career, but she created what we now know as the CBO, and we all take for granted is a solid and truly bipartisan institution. She also was the chair of OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, the vice chair of the Federal Reserve Board, and has, of course, for those of us that are from the district or live in the district, was chaired the District of Columbia Financial Management Assistance Authority, and was key to getting our city set on a fiscally sustainable path. She has been a MacArthur Fellow. She won the MacArthur Foundation Prize Fellowship in '83 and the Moynihan Prize in 2008. And this is such an incredibly true tribute. She was named one of the greatest public servants of the last 25 years by the Council for Excellence in Government in 2008, so very deservedly so. We're going to conduct this a bit as a conversation. We're going to start off with the conversation, and then we'll broaden it to everyone else in the room. But George, to start off, I mean, tell us, why did you put this book together?
Well, it all started when I was sitting in Budapest heading the then Fiscal Council, and it occurred to me that somehow we have a need. I was talking to colleagues abroad as well, those who were running these sort of institutions, and we felt really a tremendous need to share experiences among those who already were familiar with these institutions in Europe and, of course, the US, Canada, and so forth, to find out what this new generation of independent fiscal watchdogs are about. Obviously, audit offices around the world, like General Accountability Office, have a very important role, but they have already the network and so forth. I mean, they have been around for 100 years in a number of countries, 150 years. So the pattern has been set. And of course, there is a division of labor, because sometimes people ask, well, why an independent fiscal watchdog, like a Congressional Budget Office, for example? Well, there is a clear division of labor. It's a difference between, say, a pathologist and somebody, a physician in internal medicine. The pathologist looks retrospectively about the condition of the patient, or the autopsy, if you wish, after it all happened. In internal medicine, you got to do diagnostic real-time diagnostic, forward-looking, what's going to happen to this patient in the future, and so forth. And that's what these new institutions are all about. So we had about 24 countries represented at the time, and only less than 10 institutions that were doing this sort of thing. Today, we have almost 30 around the world. It's really incredible, including 3 in Latin America. Mexico claims to have such an office, but I'm afraid it's not quite there. But Peru, Colombia, Chile are setting these up. And the latest one to set up a council, a working council, is Italy. Wow, even Italy, right? That just happened in the last few months. Anyway, so it's a trend, it's an ongoing trend, and certainly the crisis, the financial crisis, which of course metamorphosed into a fiscal crisis, a number of countries gave a tremendous impetus to this sort of institutions, and all the efforts in the European Union, of course, to look closely as to what is happening in the fiscal front prompted the evolution, the origin of these institutions and evolution.
What can you tell us about the impact these institutions have both on good governance and on good fiscal health?
Well,
what did you find in the book?
It's difficult to talk about in a summary way about the impact. Certainly, they do have an impact. In fact, good governance is ultimately what this is all about. Not at the outset. I mean, governments actually don't set this up very willingly. In fact, there is a tremendous resistance. Most of them, well, some of them, and the book is divided into 3 parts. One is analytics and institutional, in general, institutional issues. The second one is about institutions such as the CBO that came about accidentally, internally driven by internal forces. And then you have the majority of those that had been established since actually 2010, March 2010, when the conference took place in Budapest, where most of these papers were presented. Most of them actually came about because of the crisis. I know of only one case where, in fact, such an institution recently has not been set up under external pressure to please the markets, as if it were, especially the markets, more than international institutions such as the IMF or the European Commission or the World Bank, and that is in the United Kingdom, where this was set up. The day after this coalition government came to power, immediately the following day, they had set it up because they wanted to gain credibility. But really, ultimately, the most important reason and impact, I would hope, is on good governance. As Chief Justice, I think, Brandeis said, sunshine is the best cure or prevention or antidote to infection. And in fact, transparency, to empower citizens and taxpayers vis-a-vis governments who sometimes may forget about them, and even legislatures. So that's really what I think is ultimately the most important.
Maybe you could tell us a little bit about how CBO came about. And I neglected to say, while praising your great past, that she's also a senior fellow at Brookings, which is one of our partner organizations, visiting professor at Georgetown, as well as the director of the Engelberg Center for Healthcare. But so how did the CBO come about in the U.S.? And certainly we're a system where Congress has a lot of authority in budget matters. But how does this happen?
Well, first, let me say a word about what are we talking about here. We're talking about independent budget offices that have a couple of functions. One is to give a nonpartisan, non-political look at what path is the government on with respect to deficits and debt, which at the moment is very important in an awful lot of places. And the other is sort of to keep the score, at least that's what CBO does, because the tendency of politicians is to be extremely optimistic about whatever it is they're proposing, and to have an independent body that will score, which the term that's used, how much this proposal is going to cost and what its effects are going to be, especially its fiscal effects, but not exclusively that. We in the United States got the Congressional Budget Office by a series of accidents. I mean, we already had a separation of powers dating from the Constitution that gave the Congress the primary power of the purse, but they weren't organized well to handle it. And it was a situation not unlike the current one, where the parties had control of different branches. It was, in this case, a Republican president and a Democratic Congress. The Republican president was Richard Nixon, and he had strong budget ideas. He wanted to cut domestic spending and increase defense. This was back in the Cold War days. And the Congress had other ideas. So they were at loggerheads over the budget. The precipitating thing was that Nixon actually did not spend some of the money that Congress had appropriated. And that's a very serious thing for a president to do. It's called impoundment of funds. And that really pushed the Congress to enough anger that they did what they had probably wanted to do for quite a while but never did, namely create a new budget process in the Congress and an independent budget office. An independent in the sense that it worked for them, and worked for both parties in both houses of Congress, and was a nonpartisan agency. So it was out of that confrontation that we got the CBO.
How did it become a nonpartisan? I mean, because I think that's one of the essential elements. I mean, it becomes this very independent, bipartisan office, nonpartisan office. Yes, not only bipartisan, nonpartisan. How does that happen? Is it opposite to becoming a tool for leadership to fight the battle with the president?
I think the Congress recognized at that time, more than they do now, that they needed to work together across party lines. That was particularly true in the Senate. The first budget committee, and the budget committee was created at the same time, so they were also new. But the leadership was strongly bipartisan. The chairman was Senator Muskie, who was a Democrat. And the ranking Republican was Henry Bellman from Oklahoma, who'd been governor of Oklahoma. And for some fortuitous reason, those two men worked together extremely well and saw that their job was to help the Congress come to some compromises over the budget that could be supported by both parties, and that would tend to get the president on board. So they set out in the statute that it was to be the CBO was to be nonpartisan.
George, is this different in parliamentary systems? I mean, is it harder to get to an independent watchdog organization?
It's a bit trickier because, as you know, in the parliamentary system, basically the prime minister and the government is part of parliament. You don't have really a separation of powers as it was invented, if you wish, by a Frenchman, Montesquieu, in the Esprit de Loi. He was the one who actually invented checks and balances in the three branches of government. So it is trickier, but at the same time, and it is trickier in the sense that the independent fiscal watchdog preferably should be outside the perimeter of Parliament. In Canada, it's called Parliamentary Budget Office, and it's part of Parliament. They have limited independence.
How did this happen in Hungary?
Well, in Hungary, actually, it was voted. I was elected unanimously by Parliament, which was incredible at the time. Tremendous polarization between right and left. I don't know if it's worse here now, but it was certainly
pretty bad here.
Pretty bad there. But on this one, I indicated to the president of the Republic who nominated me, that if I would only get simple majority would have sufficed. If I would get only the majority of one party, I would not take the position. They have to at least minimally love me at the beginning, because certainly if we do a good job, they'll hate me later on. So that was the understanding. And we operated outside Parliament, and we tried to help Parliament also, but at the same time criticize Parliament, because they would come up with about 400 or more amendment to the budget law, and we would be tough on those amendments as well, not just on what the government had proposed. But it is not as easy as that, because in the U.S., well, even Congress, I mean, has many heads. It's not like it's not a monolith, and certainly the same party's congressmen stand up to the executive. So you don't have, but with the party discipline that you have in parliaments, including the lists, you have difficulties in operating within the perimeter of Parliament. So you should try to be independent from both. Right,
sides.
right.
Is there a threat to? Oh, sorry. Is there a threat to the CBO these days also? And there seems to be a lot of sort of people questioning the way things are scored, and people wanting to question the
Oh, that's always been true.
Has that always been true? Okay,
Yeah,
so it's
I
not
mean,
more now than
what-
in the past.
the
All
Congress-
politics as usual.
The Congress, well, the Congress is more polarized, and the atmosphere is more bitter across party lines than I think it's been in my lifetime anyway. But being a nonpartisan office in the center of the storm is a very hard thing to do. And what goes with the territory is being shot at from both sides. I've told Doug Elmendorf, the current CBO director, that if you're getting criticism from both sides, you're doing your job. That's why you were asked to do this, and nobody who's thin-skinned should take the job.
Yeah. Was this your experience in Hungary in the end as well? I mean, in the end, did the Parliament try and domesticate or was it allowed to continue to be independent? I mean, what's the record, and I guess more broadly, what's the record of these organizations staying independent? Because what Congress creates or a Parliament creates, they can also modify.
Right.
In many cases. I mean, do some of these organizations succumb ultimately to pressures to become partisan or to serve?
They have to grow. It's an evolution, actually. First of all, they have to get a clear mandate of independence, which they don't necessarily get. The Canadians, for example, didn't get the head of PBO, the Parliamentary Budget Officer, as he's called, for example. He's serving at the pleasure of the Prime Minister. So he has to look around for constituencies elsewhere than just the party in power or the opposition or what have you. And in fact, this is one of the part of this evolution, and you cannot generalize because each one of these institutions is very different. But the fact is that at the beginning, everybody is skeptical. In just about the public is skeptical. Why do we need another bureaucracy? Certainly the government is not happy about having another critical voice, and the media is very skeptical also. In fact, in Britain, the Financial Times immediately started shooting at Sir Alan Budd when it looked like he was a little bit too close to the government in its assessment, maybe some chumminess. So immediately they went at it. And there is no name recognition. What is this? What is the Fiscal Council? I mean, what do they do anyway? So at the beginning is really an uphill battle. You got to set precedents very clearly. You got to hit the ground running, which sometimes they don't do. And eventually those who are your initial detractors, those who are the most skeptical, become your most important friends. So in the Canadian case, but in a number of other cases as well, ultimately, I mean, members of the press, I used to give press conferences after each one of our analysis, they almost ended up crying. The government wants to eliminate you? I said, well, that's it. Because they were so, like, what does the government would come out with a proposal that needed to be scored, or an amendment was being proposed in Parliament. And we would work day and night and that's what they do at CBO. They work day and night. I mean, these staff members of this institution are so motivated, and this is true from all colleagues whom I meet. They want to make that, and eventually you gather respect. But the initial work is uphill, very fast. It's really very thankless. But later on comes the rewards. You need two government cycles to be able to say, from different parties, to be able to say, hey, we are doing all right. We are going to survive. CBO survived, and it was not a cakewalk, right? Hungary, Venezuela did not survive. Those are the only two cases where, in fact, as the Financial Times put it in its main editorial, it has been neutered, but nothing personal, because all the institutions in Hungary, like central bank and so forth, all of them are headed by, unfortunately, they changed the constitution, they changed the law totally. Venezuela had an excellent, really an excellent CBO functioning for 3 years. The head of, I don't know if he's here, Gustavo told me he couldn't make it, but he's at the IDB right now. Anyway, let me stop right there.
Are there lessons that we can learn also from some of the other more recent models? I mean, the U.S. in many ways has the CBO as the older, it's sort of the original
it's
model.
sort of the grandfather
It's the
model.
grandfather, but then others come along and they reinvent the institution. Are there things we learn from some of the other innovations out there, or has it stood the test of time well?
Well, I think George is right that surviving through a couple of political cycles is probably the key. That certainly was true of CBO. We got started with a Republican president, namely Ford, and then CBO was criticized for taking issue with the Ford administration. But then Carter came in. He was a Democrat, and we also took issue with some of the numbers that administration was putting out. And all of a sudden, the attitude changed. Well, these guys must be all right. They tell it like it is, no matter who's the president, and that was reassuring. And I think that's happened other places. But I do think the key is, if you have a parliamentary system, the best thing to do is to establish it outside the government. Now, the Canadians may be able to make this work, but establishing it outside with a measure of independence, so it can't just be swept up in the parliamentary changes, is probably a good idea.
If I may just add, there are so many different cases. In fact, the U.S. is not the oldest one, but certainly pioneering in doing this work. The Belgians, I see the executive director from Belgium at the IMF, a good friend here, and he knows about this. The Belgian case, which has 24 members of the council, you would say, how can it work? But it fits Belgium's federalist system. They have something to offer which other countries are trying to deal with, the Spaniards, for example, and they are taking actually a close look at Belgium. It started in the 30s, really, so about the 30s. It started somewhat differently than what it is used for now. It is not totally independent in many respects, because this is a matter of degrees. I mean, it's not really an absolute thing, yes or no or anything like that. And it served very well in terms of being a guardian of fiscal soundness, when you have all these very difficult federal structure. Okay, so that has been helpful in the process. So different, but the Dutch Central Planning Bureau, which is also very old, going back to the 40s, didn't start with this mandate. Gradually, it evolved into a fiscal watchdog, for example, is part of the government, but totally independent. Nobody would dare to touch it. It has such an aura in the Netherlands and elsewhere as well. They prepare something that, in fact, would be useful in many countries, including in this one, I think. namely a test of electoral economic platforms. Before the
They actually
elections,
go through
they
the- wow.
work
Yeah.
very hard.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
It's in the book. It's,
Yeah.
it's described by the head of the institution. It's fascinating, you know. There was a presidential candidate in the U.S. with 5 points to really solve the economic problem. To this day, I don't know what's in the 5 points. The total inconsistency in the promises between fiscal rectitude and, say, lower the tax rates or increase some spending programs. How do you put that together? Well, they would actually, and it's voluntarily. The parties come to them. Okay? So first it was one party that said, please give us the seal of good housekeeping. And guess what? Now all of them are asking for it. They work really, is the toughest for them in election time. They just pray not to have too many elections, because it just consumes them all the way. And it goes even beyond fiscal, the work that they do.
It's brave of them, though.
Yeah.
Because I think it's high risk. CBO has not taken that on.
Yes, and-
And nor would I advise them to, because if they got into the business of evaluating candidates' proposals, it would be a pretty risky proposition, and everybody would be shooting at them and suspecting them of bias one way or another. I think here, at least, that's a better role for an independent think tank,
Yes.
like Brookings or the Wilson Center or somebody who's totally outside it.
I just would like to add here that many of these lessons, which we take for granted now, come from, as the Italians call it in a newspaper after the conference. They had a story on you. I don't know if I sent it to you. I should send it. La mamma del CBO. This is the way the CBO, la mamma, because it was, in my understanding, please disabuse me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that you made a decision. We are not going to get, I'm not talking about the pre-electoral evaluation, but we are not going to get in giving policy advice. Okay. And this is critical because it's at your own peril. Once you go that route, it's very, very risky. Okay. And I took this in Hungary very seriously, and certainly this is not the reason why we were extinguished in that form. But I see it in Portugal, for example. There is this urge on the part of others also outside our council, where I'm a member, and inside the council, well, we got to give policy advice to the government, how to do it better. And I said, no. And in fact, in our first hearing in Parliament, we did something that could be interpreted as giving advice. And it's fascinating how members of Parliament from the right-wing Christian Democrats all the way to the Communist Party, they spoke up. You're crossing the line. You shouldn't be giving policy advice. It was fascinating to see. It was like a test, Shall we really cross that? Even if you have a mandate, because sometimes it's in the law that sets you up. The statute says, well, advice, It's not good to go that.
I think that's very important, and I actually had the opposite experience, and I think other CBO directors have as well, that the members of Congress would urge you to give advice, would say, well, we've seen these alternatives, what do you really think? And you cannot answer that question. You have to say, keep the role distinct. We give the numbers, but we don't give advice. And
It's got to be tempting once in a while.
Oh, yeah, very tempting.
well, yes, but it has to be resisted, or you
Well,
get
it's a
into
different
a very
organization.
swampy area. But, I mean, I think that's related to the other point we haven't talked about. You mentioned results.
Yes, I was about to ask you about that. Deficits keep growing here.
Well, I think that
Is the failure of the CBO? Is this?
it's not the failure of, these institutions that we're talking about try to get the facts straight so that it improves the quality of the debate. At least they're talking about credible numbers or credible projections. They may not be right, but somebody has worked over them, and there's an agreement to start from some base. That's important, but it doesn't guarantee good policy. We've
You mean politicians might ignore the numbers? They do
politicians might refuse to make fiscally responsible decisions. I mean,
Yeah.
we're at a stalemate here.
Yeah.
We've had, we're just in gridlock. The necessary decisions are not being made, but that's not the role of the Independent Budget Office.
But since we have you here, do you have any optimism that we may get beyond that gridlock?
Oh, yes. I mean,
yes.
I'm not
People aren't constrained by those.
I'm an optimistic person, but I do think that the huge effort that went into trying to craft a so-called grand bargain here over the last several years has come up short. The grand bargain was supposed to be, how do we reduce the growth of the entitlement programs and raise some more revenue by reforming our tax code? We need to do all of those things, but I don't think we're going to get a grand bargain. We need to just work on a lot of mini bargains and make progress.
Is this the case in other organizations of similar kind? I assume the other CBOs around the world. I mean, essentially, they mostly avoided policy prescription.
Let's see what happens with Italy. But no, I mean, the experience on that score actually are very, very diverse because each country has its own historical context. Certainly, the EU is going through something very special through the crisis, obviously. There is a lot of pressure in setting up these institutions. There's a lot of advice, both from inside and outside. The problems are serious enough. Everybody has an opinion. Really, these institutions cannot do more, honestly, without having some very bad reactions than lay out the facts. Do the diagnostic as a good physician with all the information that you can gather and all the machinery. So you need a good staff and a sufficiently large staff to do the work. Certainly get into the numbers, do baseline projections, namely what if in fact there is no policy change. And that's critical because it's against that baseline, against that no policy change baseline, then projections, these super optimistic projections sometimes that governments around the world produce can be actually tested. So that's a critical element there in this process. I would like to just bring one element into this. There has to be, quite apart from these historical accidents or what have you, there has to be a minimum but fairly broad consensus in the political class and possibly support from non-governmental agencies, organizations, the public at large, academics if you wish, to set up an institution like that. If it's set up simply to please the International Monetary Fund or the European Commission or the World Bank, it's just not going to work. There has to be conviction. It has to be, institution has to be home-owned, home-grown as well, okay? The most that these institutions can do, as any other expert or advisor or whatnot, is provide technical assistance, but no more than that. To put it as a conditionality, as in fact it has been done, I fought it from within the IMF. It just doesn't going to work. This is not just a matter of passing a tax change of 1 percentage point or 5 percentage point of the value-added tax or what have you. You take it to Parliament, you do it. The Peruvians did that in the first place, something like this, with a whole set of fiscal framework at the time of Fujimori government. No debate in Parliament, nothing, just pass it. Well, when he was gone, the whole thing had to be started from scratch. So the Koreans have an independent institution. Well, it's their own type of institution. It's not, don't try to, use the cookie cutter. The cookie cutter definitely doesn't work.
Why don't we open it up, actually? This has been an incredibly great introduction to the topic. I know many people in this room have their own expertise on the subject as well and their own interest. Why don't we open it up for questions and comments and discussion here? And we're a small enough group, we should actually be able to have a good discussion. Gentleman over here. And if you don't mind waiting for the microphone, only because we also are video casting this, and we maybe have a few people following us right now. Welcome, anyone who's following us by video, and we also will keep it archived so people will be joining us in the future, joining the discussion.
I'm Gerald Chandler, and this is for Alice Rivlin. Would you tie into your history of the the Congressional Budget Office with the OMB? Which one came first? How was the formation of one influencing the other?
Yes, I'd be happy to. The history of budgeting, without going into too much detail, was very chaotic until about the time of the First World War. Actually, there wasn't a presidential budget. When agencies ran out of money, they went to the Congress and said, we need more money. It didn't matter very much because the government didn't do very much except in wartime. And in wartime, there was a more organized system, at least for getting what the military needed. But during the First World War, actually, there was a lot of sort of good government feeling, and there was a movement to organize the president's budget-making powers. And so they passed an act of Congress in 1920 that set up what was then called the Bureau of the Budget, and made rules for the president submitting a budget in January. Now it's slipped to February, but that would reflect his priorities. And the job of the Bureau of the Budget was to put together for the president a budget for the government, a budget proposal for the government that reflected what he wanted to do about defense or health or whatever he was worried about. So this was a very powerful agency, still is, with a very good staff, and it flourished through the next several decades, but the Congress never, until this incident in the early 70s with Nixon, never had an organized process for dealing with this presidential budget. The president would send it to the Hill. It was literally shredded apart. I mean, the revenue part went to one set of committees, and the spending part went to different sets of committees, depending on what the subject was. And they would pass appropriations bills or revenues bills separately and at different times. And it was the recognition that that wasn't working very well, together with the confrontation with President Nixon, that created the new budget process and the CBO.
A gentleman here, and then we'll go down to the end.
Dan Lieberman. Yeah, there's a group called, proposes what they call modern monetary theory. I don't know if you're familiar with it, and I don't find it very modern or theoretical, but they claim that a sovereign nation whose currency is accepted can print money forever, and therefore never go bankrupt, and therefore could run debts that are always sustainable. I wonder if you have any comment on that.
It can print money, but it's the value of that money that's questionable. If you print too much of it, it's not worth much. Printing money doesn't get you out of the dilemma.
And that's coming from the U.S., which is the banker of the world.
Yeah.
But other countries, as you know, elsewhere around the world, soon enough they're going to find the limits because they're borrowing from abroad much of their financing, and the spigots, the faucets just
The fact,
goes up,
Yeah,
and they can go into hyperinflation, a huge external crisis, and that's the end of it. You have sort of an example of that with Argentina.
Yeah, I don't subscribe to it, but what people notice is the U.S. has gone into tremendous debts. We're up to 16 trillion if you include their internal debt and government agencies themselves, and yet there has not been any real inflation, and that seems to contradict what most people thought about running debt.
well, I think that's right, but we haven't pulled out of this recession entirely, and I frankly don't think that inflation is the danger in running up a high debt in the circumstances that the U.S. is in. The danger in running up a high debt is you have to pay interest on it. And as interest rates rise, the U.S. now is going to find that it's the carrying cost of this debt is eating up a lot of the revenue of the government, and you have to pay the interest off the top. So if it's a big interest bill, you can't do any of the other things you want to do.
Gentleman at the end.
James saying, a technical question. CBO traditionally scores or forecasts points, usually with a baseline in maybe one scenario. There's a school of thought that says that the scoring should be done with ranges. I'm wondering whether, since the future is very unknown and in reality one only has ranges, do the other equivalents of the CBO abroad forecast in points, or do they actually produce ranges?
Yeah.
You find it will make a difference?
Clearly, the future is very uncertain. Projections are very uncertain. There should be a range around any projection, and the CBO does give them. If you look at its documents, they don't feature them. The reason they don't feature them is they aren't very useful. What members of Congress do is pick the midpoint of the range. And if you're adding up a set of proposals to say, what is the total cost of this, the ranges get less and less useful because obviously they get wider and wider. If you pick the high end of the range for all of the proposals, then it's hugely expensive. And if you pick the low end for all of them, it's much less. And they just go back to the midpoint, and the ranges don't do you much good.
There are examples where independent fiscal institutions and governments themselves do explicitly estimate risks, and the risks are done through sensitivity analysis and ranges.
So CBO does that too.
And CBO does that as well. Now, this is getting a little bit more and more fancy over time. The British Office for Budget Responsibility, the Slovak Council for Budget Responsibility as well, both, and there are a few others as well, who go a little bit deeper and use stochastic methods, probabilistic methods, to do sensitivity analysis. So it's getting, I mean, there is a literature moving forward, and country practices are becoming more and more sophisticated because they are living in the shadow of an uncertain world. I mean, that's the reality. I thought you were going to ask about dynamic scoring, which is a little bit different. Yeah, okay.
It depends a little bit whether you're talking about just a forecast, where there clearly should be a range, or some budget control mechanism where you're saying we have a limit, we're capping the expenditures at X, or we're capping the deficit at X, which is a very bad idea because deficits are differences between two numbers and not easily capped. But for budget control purposes, you really need a point estimate.
We're going around the table, Mike Van Deusen, and then we'll come to the gentleman here.
Dr. Rivlin, thank you for being here. For George, I wanted to know whether the case of Hungary and the case of Venezuela, those are the two cases where such a body existed, where for political reasons, is that right, they were disbanded, or are there other cases? And for Dr. Rivlin, I wanted your sense, Frank's sense of what off-budget spending and supplemental spending to finance wars, etc. How that has complicated the process of CBO over the last couple of decades.
For any of these institutions, when they do their job, they can face an existential problem. Take the case of Canada and Sweden. In both cases, very good job technically, what they've been doing and so forth, but the government didn't particularly like to be criticized on whatever program, even the Afghanistan campaign that they had and things like that, military expenditures in the case of Canada. In the case of Sweden, there were other issues. But anyway, there were not so veiled threats of cutting down their budget for next year if they continue to be critical. So this is what happens with the purse, namely their own budget. Are they going to get enough funding to be able to do their work? So that's an existential problem. The British, by the way, solved that by saying, okay, we are going to ask for appropriations for the next 4 years, fixed. This is what we need to, and Parliament approved. And for 4 years, they don't have to worry about it. They can build up track record and so forth. In the case of Hungary and Venezuela, of course, they are very different countries, different episodes, if you wish, but they have some common features because they are the only ones where, in fact, the government, voted in by a majority, of course, decided to take a constitutional mandate. They changed the constitution. They amended, hundreds of laws immediately. So this was part of the process to neuter an institution and many other institutions that would be critical of the government. So what they did was to change it. In Hungary, there is, in fact, de jure, if you wish, there is a fiscal council. 3 wise men, all 3 of them appointed by the government, 1 member, the head of it, and 1 member is the head of the audit office, which is very close to the prime minister, former member of parliament. The other one, the central bank governor, also very close, former finance minister. So they're not going to really be critical in this sense. And no staff, they have to rely on the staff of the audit office, central bank, and so forth. But the staff, the 40 people who worked at the time for, in the institution are no longer there. They have been just, in the case of Venezuela, the same thing. For a while, there was still a congressional budget office, but only in name. And it would be those who were close to the president sitting there. Eventually, in fact, there is no longer even that office anymore. It's a situation where the government cannot tolerate any sort of critical statement. And there was not really much support from the citizenry, not at least a critical mass of support to overturn these in either country. So it's most unfortunate, but the memory lingers on in both countries. Well, there is, when we had such an institution, well, it was It was useful, I suppose. But not every society, not every country is ready for an institution like this. And it's not true that, it's only the Swedes, because they are so, or the Dutch, and, they know how to handle fiscal prudence. They went through crises. They went, during the Dutch disease, they were playing with fiscal numbers all over. The structural budget balance, which is now the hottest cake in Europe, was first tried, to my knowledge, by the Dutch. And they abused it all the way. At the end, we didn't have any meaning, the structural budget balance rule that they had, which conceptually it's wonderful. In practice, it's a big question whether it's going to be really complied with by European governments.
Off-budget spending, not very important, I think. There was a time when there were the sort of budget purists like me were concerned about government-sponsored agencies and the Tennessee Valley Authority and so forth being off budget, and you couldn't quite see what was going on unless you added them in. That's not really true anymore. There isn't significant off-budget spending, and now Fannie Mae and Freddie are part of the government, which isn't desirable, but puts them back on the budget. The question of George Bush financing the war off budget, I think, is pretty much a misunderstanding. It is true that he did not usually put a full year's military spending in his budget proposal. The budget proposal has a very long lead time. And the budget proposal has to be made in the fall to be presented to the Congress in February for the year that doesn't start until October. And so the military was saying, we don't know what we're going to be spending in October, well, October is one thing, but the second half of the fiscal year, a year and a half from now, July of the next fiscal year, what do we know about what will be going on in Iraq or Afghanistan? So we're only going to give you 4 months or 6 months of military expenditures and then come back for a supplemental budget. There was a lot of criticism of that, and the Obama administration has not done it. They have tried to give a full year budget, and that's certainly better. But I think the public thought that maybe these expenditures were secret or something, off budget. You couldn't see them. That was never true. It was just they didn't put the full year in the February budget. And once the money was spent, it was spent and it was there for anybody to see. And when they ran out of money, they had to come back for a supplemental. But I rather thought that was justified. It is hard to predict in a war how much it's going to cost.
And it's more the question of how the budgeting process has changed over time in the United States as well, right? I mean, a lot of things are increasingly outside of the traditional budgeting process in Congress, but it's still on budget. It's still within the budget. Just the use of continuing resolutions. I mean, the traditional congressional budget process changed, but in terms of scoring and in terms of monitoring, it's all within the budget.
Oh, the congressional budget process, the process of decision-making,
has changed.
Has practically died.
Well, died, yes. That would be a more appropriate term. Yes.
It was it's died of its own complexity, and it's died of gridlock.
Yeah.
But that's a different question.
But it's a different question, right. And the final question is from this gentleman here.
Thank you. My name is Marco Varea. I wanted to ask you, Mr. Kopitz, about in Latin American, fiscal independence offices are pretty rare, I would say. In some cases, they've been taking over CBO-like office, if there are some cases, but they have not been very successful. Some NGOs took the role of fiscal surveillance. And my question would be, what do you think are the main conditions to make them successful institutions for fiscal surveillance?
I should say George knows Latin America particularly well, so this is.
Well, you'd be surprised how much I learn every day, though. Always new tricks. First of all, is the fear of the unknown. It's not only Latin America, it's elsewhere as well. There is that fear, gosh, what if we have a fiscal watchdog like that? How embarrassing it might be. And in the short run, yeah, it is probably embarrassing anyway.
Greece, for example.
Greece, they just started. Yeah. They started beginning of this year. I met the head of the Greek in Jerusalem at the conference, head of the Greek Fiscal Council. But I mean, I think that they're beyond embarrassment there. So it's not, but certainly there is that fear that, hey, we are going to get these guys loose, and it's a problem. So, and there is that feeling that as they say in Spanish, pasito, mi amor, pasito, con mucho disimulito. Just gradually we are going to, and these gradual things sometimes,
faking it. Yes.
Because it's not, so it's good to hit the ground running. I keep telling whenever I'm in an advisory type of situation, and but the thing is that there is this fear. So the way they start out is by having the Minister of Finance, having the office just adscrito, as they have in Peru, for example, to the Ministry of Finance. Or in Colombia, they also have very close to the Ministry of Finance, which in fact, it doesn't matter. The formal arrangement doesn't matter. In France and Finland, for example, they're part of the judiciary. In Holland, for example, part of the executive. In many countries, it's part of the legislative. In other parts, it's sort of undefined, if you wish, but independent, autonomous. The name doesn't matter. I mean, it's the fact of independence which is critical. Now, take the case of Chile, which in my mind, is really up there among all Latin American countries. I don't know where you're from, but and they know it, and they are very proud of it, and it's wonderful. However, they set up this institution in January, just as a little anecdote, in January of this year, and the Minister of Finance named the lineup of excellent degrees, good economists, fiscal economists, the head of it run by, he was running it up until April of this year, April I think it was. Yes, MIT PhD, he was chief economist at the OECD, he was here at the bank. And lo and behold, new government came in. New government, new Minister of Finance decided, no, I want another lineup. So they changed him. By the way, there is nothing wrong with the successor. He also has a MIT PhD, but the problem is that sort of behavior, and that's even just the appearance of a government changing the head of the fiscal watchdog. It's not a healthy one. It's not a good one. It certainly doesn't inspire confidence. So they have to get over this. They have to really plunge, and they have to say, okay, it's going to be independent. We want it to be independent. We are going to give them the tools to do their work, and that's it. And then come, and of course, we want very competent individuals to run this. So that's difficult. I don't know if, and they're not going through necessarily a crisis. They just see that they could be going through a crisis in the future, and they want to build institutions. So, I mean, hey, it's good. I'm glad that Chile at least has this, or Peru, something similar, or Colombia, or Mexico. I mean, it's great, but it's a learning process, probably. It's a learning curve, that's the way I would characterize it.
Well, thank you. We've actually reached the end of we've reached our witching hour here, the end of the program. But thank you very much, George Kopitz, for putting together the program, Alice Rivlin for taking time to join us today, and for some very deep thoughts on this, and look forward to continuing the conversation with all of you.
And thanks for coming.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
And does anyone know the story of the game?
Yeah, that's 1-0.
Germany.
Germany is winning.